Serena Calloway, 28 years old, and I used to believe that working hard enough could eventually make someone love you the right way. I don't believe that anymore. The moment I stopped believing it was the night my parents threw a dinner party to celebrate my younger brother's engagement, handed him a check for $30,000 toward a down payment on a house, and then, 3 hours later, slid a printed invoice across the kitchen counter telling me I owed them $800 a month in rent. Starting immediately, because as my father put it, I was the responsible one. I could handle it. I'm going to back up because that night didn't happen in a vacuum. Nothing like that ever does. Growing up, I was what people politely call the easy child. I got good grades without being asked. I kept my room clean. I didn't cause scenes. My younger brother, who I'll call my brother because that's what he was to me for most of my life, was different. He needed reminding. He needed follow-up. He needed the same conversation repeated across different years and different forms. I never resented him for it. That's just who he was, and I loved him anyway. What I did start to resent, slowly and then all at once, was the way our parents responded to that difference. They poured everything into him: patience, attention, money, celebration, and they handed me higher expectations like a reward for meeting the last set. Every A I brought home earned a nod. Every A he scraped together earned a dinner out. When I graduated college with honors and a job already lined up, my mother made a lasagna and my father shook my hand. When my brother finally passed his real estate licensing exam on the third attempt, they threw a party with a banner. I moved back home at 26. It was practical. I was working at a nonprofit doing grant writing and program coordination. Meaningful work that didn't pay the way it should. The plan was to stay for 18 months, save aggressively, and then move into my own place without wiping out everything I had. My parents said, of course, "Take your time, we love having you here." My father told me it would help them too, having someone around to help with things while they got older. I took that seriously. I handled groceries twice a week. I took my mother to her eye appointments when my father was busy. I fixed things around the house. I stayed out of the way when I wasn't needed and showed up fully when I was. My brother lived 40 minutes away with his girlfriend Laurel in an apartment their parents had never charged them for. He visited on weekends sometimes, and when he did, the energy in the house changed. My mother cooked more. My father laughed louder. I became furniture. The engagement happened in March. Laurel said yes on a hiking trail my brother had scouted specifically because she loved that particular view. It was sweet. I genuinely thought it was sweet. I texted him that night and told him I was happy for him, and I meant it. What I wasn't prepared for was the way our parents responded to the news. My mother started planning a dinner for the extended family within 48 hours. She called my father's sister, both of her own sisters, my grandparents, 3 couples who had known my brother since childhood. She ordered flowers. She found a tablecloth that had apparently been waiting in a closet for exactly this occasion. She called me at work to ask if I could take that Friday off to help her cook. I took the day off. I spent most of it in the kitchen while my mother described in granular detail everything she admired about Laurel. She was warm, she was grounded. She was exactly the kind of woman who would be good for my brother. I stirred soup and said, and genuinely agreed with most of it. Laurel was good for him. That wasn't the problem. The problem arrived gradually, the way most problems do, until it was standing right in front of me and I couldn't pretend I hadn't seen it coming. Dinner was loud and full in the way extended family dinners always are. My uncle made a toast that was somehow both too long and too vague. My grandmother cried. Laurel sat beside my brother, looking luminous and a little overwhelmed, and I sat 3 seats away and watched my father look at his son the way I had spent most of my life quietly waiting to be looked at. When the plates were being cleared and the champagne was half gone, my father stood up. He tapped his glass with a fork and the table went quiet. He talked about what it meant to watch his son grow into a man. He said my brother had always had a big heart, and that a big heart was worth more than any grade or any trophy. He looked at Laurel and told her she was gaining a family that would always show up for her. He said some things take time to find their shape, and watching my brother find his was one of the great privileges of his life. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. He set it on the table in front of my brother. My brother opened it. Inside was a check for $30,000. My father said he and my mother had been setting it aside for this. For the moment, my brother was ready to plant roots somewhere and they wanted him to have it now because the housing market wasn't getting any kinder and they didn't want him to wait. The table erupted. My grandmother grabbed my father's arm. My uncle whistled. Laurel covered her mouth with her hand. My brother sat there with the check in his fingers and looked like he might cry. I smiled. I kept smiling. I moved my fork around what was left of my dessert, and I told myself this was his moment and I wasn't going to make it about me. I hugged him later in the hallway when the guests were starting to leave. I hugged Laurel too. I helped my mother with the dishes while my father and my brother sat in the living room talking about neighborhoods. It was close to 11 when the last guests left. I was wiping down the counters and thinking about the drive to work the next morning when my father came into the kitchen. He was still in his good shirt, but he'd taken off his jacket. He leaned against the counter across from me and he said, in the same even tone he used to discuss utility bills, that he and my mother had been talking, and that with everything getting more expensive, they thought it made sense for me to start contributing to the household. I set down the dish towel. $800 a month, he said. First of the month starting in 30 days. It was fair, he said. Below market for the area. He was doing me a favor. I stood there in my parents' kitchen, in the house where I had grown up, and I did the math in my head. $30,000 handed across a dinner table to celebrate an engagement. $800 a month charge to the daughter who had been grocery shopping and driving to appointments and asking for nothing. I asked him directly. I said, you just gave him $30,000 tonight. Why am I being charged rent? He looked at me the way he always looked at me when I pointed out something he didn't want to examine. He said my brother was starting a life. He needed a foundation. I had a job and a salary, and I was an adult who had been here long enough. It was time. I said, I've been here a year and a half. I've been helping you every week. I've never asked you for anything. He said, and that's always been your strength. You don't need the same support he does. I said, so I'm being charged extra because I never needed as much? He said, you're being charged because you're capable of handling it. I looked at him for a long moment. I waited to feel something break. What I felt instead was something settle. Like a question I'd been asking for years had finally been answered in plain language, and I no longer had to wonder. I asked him one more thing. I said, do you think that's fair? He said, I think it's practical. Then he said goodnight and went upstairs. I stood in that kitchen for a while after he left. I could hear my mother moving around upstairs. I could hear the television my brother had turned on in the living room before he and Laurel headed home. I looked at the tablecloth my mother had saved for a special occasion. I looked at the good china that only came out for celebrations. Then I went to my room, and I did not sleep. I called my best friend the next morning. She had been listening to me talk about my family for 6 years. She didn't say I told you so. She said, what do you need? I said I needed to know if I was making this into something it wasn't. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, $30,000 and $800 a month in the same night. Serena, no you are not. Hearing my name said back to me like that, by someone who knew all of it, helped me breathe. I spent the next 3 days living quietly inside the decision I had already made but hadn't said out loud yet. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner and set a plate out for my mother. I answered questions about my day in full sentences. I did not bring up the conversation in the kitchen. I don't think my father expected me to. On the 4th day, I called my landlord from 2 years ago. He had a studio coming open. It was small and the light was bad, but it was available and the price was manageable and it was mine if I wanted it. I said I wanted it. On the 5th day, I started packing. I wasn't dramatic about it. I didn't tear things off shelves or throw anything in bags. I took what was actually mine, which was less than I expected, and I left what was genuinely communal, which was more than I realized. I made 2 piles. The pile I was taking and the pile I was leaving behind, which included a box of old school papers and a shelf of trophies from high school and a photograph from my college graduation that had been propped on my dresser for 2 years because my mother had framed it. But my father had never asked about it. I left that photograph. I wrote a note. It took me 4 drafts. The first one was too much. The second was too cold. The third tried to explain everything, which was wrong because nothing I could write would explain everything, not in one note, not after 28 years. The fourth one said what needed to be said. It said, I'm moving out. Not because of the rent, but because of what the conversation in the kitchen told me about my place here. I love you both. I love my brother. This isn't disappearing. This is me finally understanding what I need. I'll be in touch. I put it on the kitchen table under the sugar bowl, where my mother would find it in the morning when she made coffee. Then I loaded my car and I left. My phone started going off by 7 the next morning. My mother called 4 times before 8. My brother texted saying she was upset and asking what was going on. My father sent a single message that said, "This is an overreaction." I read them all. I responded to my brother first. I told him I was okay, I had found a place and I would explain everything soon. I told him this had nothing to do with him or Laurel. I did not respond to my father. My mother and I talked that evening, a long and difficult call that started with her crying and ended somewhere closer to honest. She said she didn't know what my father had said to me. I told her. She went quiet in the way she went quiet. When something landed on her, she couldn't immediately deflect. She didn't defend him. She didn't apologize for him either. But she stopped trying to convince me to come back, and that meant something. The studio was exactly as described. The light was bad. The kitchen was a counter with 2 burners. The closet was more of a suggestion. I bought a second-hand lamp, a used rug, and a set of curtains from a discount store, and I arranged everything twice until it felt like mine. Then I sat on the floor eating takeout pasta and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could account for, like I was living inside my own life instead of on the margins of someone else's. Work helped. My manager had always treated me like someone whose opinion counted, which was not something I had experienced in every room I'd ever sat in. And I was only now understanding how much I had undervalued it. I threw myself into a grand proposal I'd been half-hearted about and I got it finished, and we got the funding, and my manager sent me an email that said simply, "Great work. This matters." I printed it out. I taped it in my refrigerator. I know how that sounds. I don't care. My brother called me 2 weeks after I moved out. He asked if we could get coffee. We met at a place near his apartment. A small spot with good espresso and a corner table that had just enough noise around it to make a hard conversation easier. He sat across from me and asked what happened. I told him without drama and without editing. The dinner, the check, the kitchen, the conversation, the 4 drafts of the note. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment and then he said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "I should have." I said, "Maybe, but that's not why I'm telling you now. I'm telling you because you asked and because you're my brother and I'm not interested in having secrets between us." He told me that after I left, our father had been difficult in a way that was hard to describe, short with everyone, dismissive. Our mother was managing him and managing the house and managing the distance I had put there, and it was wearing on her. He said the dinner table felt wrong. He said he'd caught himself thinking about things he'd never questioned before, about who showed up and who got celebrated, and whether those 2 things matched up the way he'd always assumed they did. I didn't say anything to that. I just let him sit in it. He said he was sorry. Not a sweeping apology, not an attempt to fix everything with one conversation, just a simple and direct, "I'm sorry that this happened to you for this long." It was the first time anyone in my family had said those words to me in that order, and I had to look out the window for a moment before I could answer him. I said, "Thank you. That actually helps." We sat there for another hour. We talked about Laurel and the house they were looking at and whether the neighborhood had good transit. We talked about a road trip he and I had taken when I was 18 and he was 15, and we'd gotten lost for 2 hours in the rain and laughed about it all the way home. We talked about nothing important, and it was one of the better conversations I'd had in months. 2 months after I moved out, my mother came to see my apartment. She brought a plant. A small succulent in a terracotta pot with a little card that said, "For your new place." I put it on the windowsill where it actually gets the best light in the whole studio, which is to say not much, but enough. We drink tea. She looked around at everything I had made do with: the secondhand lamp, the curtains from the discount store, the rug with a pattern I had chosen myself for the first time in my adult life. She didn't say it was nice. She said, "You did this yourself." It came out almost like a realization. I said, "Yes." She said, "I should have seen it sooner." I asked her what she meant. She looked at her tea for a moment and then she said, "You've always done things yourself. We should have made more noise about it." It wasn't everything I had ever wanted to hear. It wasn't an apology on behalf of my father, who had not reached out to me except once. A brief and technical email about some mail that had arrived for me, which I took as the closest thing to a door left cracked. It was not a dismantling of 28 years, but it was real, and it was hers, and I believed her. My father and I did not speak for 4 months. When we finally did, it was at my brother's housewarming, in a kitchen that was not mine, surrounded by people who were happy and loud and oblivious to the specific weight of what was being navigated in the corner where my father and I ended up standing together by the back door. He said, "You look well." I said, "I am." He said, "The place you found, is it working out?" I said, "Yes." He looked out into the backyard where my brother and Laurel were taking pictures with the first piece of furniture they'd bought together. A ridiculous patio table with an umbrella in a color Laurel described as terracotta and my brother described as orange. My father almost smiled at that. Then he said, "I handled that badly. Not the rent, the way I talked about it, the timing." I waited. I had learned to wait with him, to not fill the silence with reassurance he hadn't earned yet. He said, "Your mother pointed out that I have a habit of taking for granted the people who make things easy." He paused. "She's not wrong." It was not a full accounting. It was not a reckoning. But it was Richard Wilson stepping out from behind 28 years of his own certainty, long enough to look at what he'd done, and for a man who had spent my entire childhood treating my competence as proof he didn't need to pay attention. It was more than I'd expected in that kitchen or that year, or maybe ever. I said, "I appreciate you saying that. I meant it. I also meant what came next." I said, "I'm not moving back, but I'm not going anywhere either. If you want a different relationship with me than the one we had, I'm open to building it. Slowly." He nodded. He looked relieved in the way that people look when they've been bracing for a punishment that doesn't come. We joined the rest of the party. My brother pulled me into a photo. Laurel asked me to help her figure out where to hang a mirror. I spent an hour doing something useful and wanted, which is a combination I had been finding more often in my own life than I ever had while living in my parents' house. The plant my mother brought me is still on my windowsill. It has not died. I consider this a minor victory. The studio is still small, and the light is still bad, and the closet is still more of a suggestion, but I've stopped noticing those things. What I notice instead is that every object in this apartment was chosen by me. Every decision I made here I made because it suited the life I was actually living, not the one I was trying to perform for an audience that kept changing the requirements. I think about what I would have done if I'd just paid the $800. I think I know. I would have paid it and resented it and stayed smaller than I needed to be, waiting for a recognition that would never arrive in a form I could receive. I would have kept optimizing myself for a metric my father kept moving. I would have called that family. I don't regret leaving. I sometimes miss the version of home I used to imagine was possible, but I stopped confusing that with the home that actually existed. That's the clearest thing I can offer to anyone sitting in a situation that looks like mine, that loves are real and patterns are also real, and you don't have to choose between loving someone and maiming what they've done. You can hold both. And sometimes, when you stop bending yourself to protect other people from the truth of your own experience, something shifts. Not always, not completely, but enough. My brother texted me last week to say he'd gotten an A on the first class he's taking toward a business certificate. He added 3 exclamation points and a photo of the grade on his laptop screen. I called him immediately. I told him I was proud of him. He laughed and said, "You sound like Mom." I told him that was the nicest thing anyone had said to me all week. It was. The succulent my mother brought me is still alive. I know that sounds like a small thing to hold on to, but when you've spent most of your adult life measuring your worth by other people's responses to you, sometimes a plant that doesn't die feels like evidence of something. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since leaving, not in any mystical sense, just the plain mechanical kind. The way one honest action, taken at the right moment, can shift the entire architecture of a situation that seemed fixed. I paid the price of admission into my own life when I packed those bags and left that note on the table. And what came back wasn't punishment. It was clarity. My mother brought a plant. My brother asked how I was doing before he asked anything else. My father eventually said the words he had never in 28 years found a way to say. None of that happened while I was still inside the house, making myself smaller and quieter and more useful, waiting for someone to notice. What I understand now is that there are 3 things that actually carry you through a moment like the one I had in that kitchen, and none of them come from outside you. The first is your sense of what's right, not what's easy or what keeps the peace, but what's actually true. I knew something was wrong the moment my father slid that invoice across the counter. I didn't need a second opinion. I had been paying attention my whole life and the evidence was consistent. Trusting that read, even when my first instinct was to second-guess it, was the most morally honest thing I had done in years. It would have been easier to pay the $800. It would have been easier to say nothing. Easier is not the same as right. The second thing is the willingness to think clearly when you're hurting. That night, I didn't react. I went to my room and I did math. I looked at my savings. I called the landlord. I wrote 4 drafts of a note until I found the one that was honest without being cruel. That kind of thinking under pressure isn't cold. It's a form of self-respect. It means you're treating your own future like it matters enough to plan for. The third thing is the part that doesn't get enough credit, which is just staying with it. Moving into a studio with bad light and a closet that's more of a suggestion and not going back. Answering your mother's calls even when they're hard. Sitting across from your brother at a coffee shop and telling him the whole truth without softening it for his comfort. That's not a dramatic act, it's a sustained one. It's showing up for your own life repeatedly, on ordinary days without an audience. What happened in my family? Happened because certain patterns go unexamined until someone refuses to keep participating in them. I was that person, not because I was braver than anyone else, but because I had finally run out of reasons to keep pretending the cost wasn't real. The people who love you sometimes need you to stop absorbing their mistakes before they can see them clearly. That's a hard thing to be responsible for. It's also, I think, the truest kind of love. Not the kind that smooths everything over, but the kind that holds the line anyway. The note I left on that table opened more doors than any conversation I'd had in that house for years. Sometimes the quietest exit is the loudest thing you can say.